The idea that there's this opposition to speak rationally, yeah.
Widening chasm of nihilism.
There are many justifications for madness have been coming out of that hole. This opposition between reason and everything else, I think, is fundamentally spurious. I think this idea that there's love on the one hand and then the cool rationality of science that's just all clatter and clockwork and soulless. This is a false dichotomy, and it's a dichotomy that is pervasive in the culture. You can't I can't tell you how many times I get on the radio and someone says, "Scientifically prove to me that you love your wife," as though that were just the knockdown argument of all time against reason and in support of faith. There's nothing irrational in principle about love. I mean, it is rational to value love. It is rational to try to recognize that it is one of our most cherished experiences, and then to try to live a life that maximizes it. Understanding love at the level of the brain is not going to deflate its importance for us. And the fact that we can understand the molecular constituents of chocolate doesn't make us not want to eat chocolate. I mean, these are different scales of interaction with the world. And so it's not a matter of only being coldly calculating in our approach to life, but where we have to call a spade is in gratuitous claims to certainty about invisible realities and the moral structure to the universe, about a God who so hates homosexuality that he will whip up tsunamis in defense of chaste heterosexual people. I mean, this is a vision of life that is animating millions and millions of our neighbors, and we have been cowed into not criticizing it. And I mean, to pick up what Pat Churchland said, this job is not best done by scientists. We need from 100 sides, culture at large, to just make it fundamentally embarrassing to hold these kinds of certainties. And I don't know if you know about how the KKK, how its stature got so eroded in this country, but there's this great little story about this guy Stetson Kennedy, who leaked. He joined the KKK. And then he leaked all their goofy lingo and secret passwords to the people who were writing the Adventures of Superman radio series back in the 40s. And so every week, it was Superman fighting the KKK with all the up-to-the-minute passwords and handshakes and bogus, cultish nonsense. And so these grand wizards would come home and they would see their kids playing the KKK versus Superman on the front lawn, with Superman winning and all the current passwords. And they found this so humiliating, and this was so corrosive. And Stetson Kennedy was still, inside the Klan. He would see the aftermath of these effects at meetings, and I'm sure there were other variables involved. But the KKK is functionally a defunct organization, whereas it had 20 million members, among whom were senators and even one president. It's possible to make progress. And I think we just have to keep that in view.
So,
To believe,
another thing that was interesting in that poll was that physicians were more likely than scientists. 60% of U.S. physicians believe in a personal God. And I think that probably shouldn't be surprising, simply because physicians are the people who have to tell people all day long that they're going to die, or they tell the family that their family member is going to die. And I think death is very much central to this what is otherwise quite an astonishing feature of our discourse, that so many people believe the preposterous. I mean, there is no story that is going to so totally inure you to the tragedy of the death of your own child better than the story that she has been taken up to be with Jesus again, and you're going to see her in a few short years. And so these religious myths are paying enormous dividends, emotional dividends for people. And I think it is the job of science to present a fully positive account of just how we can be happy and in this world and reconciled to our circumstance. One which, the alternative that religion is essentially offering people in that situation is the alternative to learning how to grieve. I mean, rather than learn how to grieve as children, we learn how to believe that death doesn't exist. or is in some cases a good thing, the best thing that could possibly happen to you as you get in this cult of martyrdom. But one thing I think we should call attention to here is something that Michael brought up in his talk, is that there's a difference between, in a context like this, calling a spade and really calling delusion, and doing it across the board in every social situation where you become this boorish character who, you get into an elevator and you see someone with a cross around her neck and you lurch toward her and try to take away Jesus in that moment. This is not something that anyone, I think, is advocating. I'm probably one of the more strident people here, and I'm not advocating that. But I think that even here we are suffering the taboos that I'm trying to call attention to, and I know Richard quite eloquently and for many years has been calling attention to, the taboo around criticizing these esteemed religious myths. We can laugh at a belief in Zeus, but we can't laugh at a belief in Allah or the biblical God, even here. And I just want to point out that, I mean, our situation is so uncanny. I mean, we have a world that has been shattered by literature, and I think we have to marshal an emotional response that the same response we would have if we woke up in a world tomorrow where, all the violence in the Middle East, all the bloodletting, all the wars and threat of future war was born of rival interpretations of the plays of Shakespeare, where the Jews like King Lear and the Muslims like Hamlet, and they're willing to blow themselves up in crowds of children over the difference. Okay, that seems like an impossibly bizarre world to live in, and yet that is exactly the world we are living in. And if we could come face to face with that strangeness, I think we wouldn't be wasting much time wondering about whether there is a conflict between religion and science.
You want to say something? Since you are... Did you want to come on down here?
Got a mic for him here. Sam?
See, this is the director of the Hayden Planetarium who does this all the time.
He's got something to say himself, by the way.
What?
He's got something to say himself.
Neil, yes, I know. Well, why don't you both come down here? That'd be much easier, if you don't mind.
Us both?
Yes. Because I think you both had responses to this.
I did have a response, but it's his turn.
Well, it's all right. You can just leave the mic up there and come on down.
Okay, I can hand him the mic. That's fine.
Are you jet-lagged? You could just take a chair. Take a seat. I'll take the mic. Now, Sam, you've actually written on Buddhism, and you have an essay which I recall called "Kill the Buddha."
Yeah,
because you take
although it's
you
not
take it's obviously from that very old what was it, 12th century monk or something.
There's a koan.
But your position is that in fact, well, why don't you say what your position is?
I just wanted to first respond to you, Joan, because I feel like something in my remarks struck you as a caricature both of religion and science, as you said, and I want to dispute that, although conceding several points to you. One is that the point that Richard conceded, which is it may be that there is room for different voices here, and it may be politically necessary to, at various moments, use the language of a community so as to draw them into an actual engagement with modernity. But you were saying much more than that. You were basically saying that it is highly doubtful that we can get morality really up on a foundation without believing something religious, without believing that one of our books is not an ordinary book but may be the Word of God or may be the best book ever written, never to be superseded. And I highly doubt that. And I think when the conversation moves into morality, I want to try to give you a rational foundation, what I think is a truly rational foundation for morality, which doesn't partake of any superstition. But the thing I want to point out to you is that it seemed to me you're pointing out the role of bias in science. You're saying that you can pick out individual scientists or individual theories or individual moments in science where scientists were just flat wrong, and they were wrong based on their own biases. And that is a totally legitimate thing to do. It is a totally scientific thing to do. I mean, bias in science is bad science. Bias in religion is faith, it's doctrine, it's redeeming, it's holy. I mean, you don't have the same corrective mechanism in religion. And just before you, I just want to bring in Pat Churchland's piece. The reason why neuroscientists are queuing up to meet with the Dalai Lama and not with the Pope is that there is a different discursive tradition within Buddhism than within Christianity and certainly within Islam. And you know, the Tibetan Buddhism is, in its totality, being practiced as a religion by most Tibetan Buddhists in this world. But the Dalai Lama is a very sophisticated connoisseur of modernity, and he's interested in science. And there is an empiricism to Buddhism which makes legitimate the statement that you hear on the lips of many Buddhists that Buddhism is not even a religion. It's a philosophy. It's a mode it's an introspective methodology. And I hope to say something more about that. But the thing that has to be admitted in the spirit of science is that whatever is discovered by meditation, for instance, is not Buddhist. I mean, we don't talk about Muslim algebra. We don't talk about Christian physics, and there are good reasons why we don't, because those are real areas of discourse, and they got lifted out of the cultural contingencies where they were discovered. And we will not talk about Buddhist meditation ultimately, and the Dalai Lama is unique among religious figures in that he will admit that. I know troubles Richard about this is that religious people tend not to be honest about where those changes are coming from. They're coming from, to my mind, the hammer blows of modernity that make certain religious doctrines untenable. So, for instance, now the Pope is rethinking the doctrine about contraception. You know, maybe a married couple, within the context of a marriage, if one is HIV positive, maybe it's okay to use a condom. Let's say he gives ground on that.
Yeah.
That will not be a sign of the vibrancy of Christian dialogue getting to the truth of the matter. That will be a sign of a given religious dogma becoming untenable in the face of its practical consequences and in the face of the fact that there's no good reason to have it there in the first place. And so what Pat is referencing about the Dalai Lama is quite a bit more seditious than that. I mean, the Dalai Lama has said, if science proves any principle of Buddhism to be incorrect, science wins. Now that is a much more radical statement coming from the head of a church. And what I heard Richard saying, which I fully agree with, is if these are all just books, you know, we have a choice between having a 21st century dialogue about ethics and the nature of reality, or we can fixate ourselves in the first century if we're going to hold to the New Testament, or the 7th century if we're going to hold to the Quran. And if there's something good in the Bible that is really standing the test of time, which I think there is. I mean, it's not much of it, I don't think, but the Golden Rule, for instance, I think is one of the most beautiful distillations of our ethical impulses. We can use the Golden Rule in the 21st century without believing anything preposterous. And we can see the wisdom of it, and then we can jettison all the rest that we effectively jettison anyway, because nobody's reading Leviticus now and saying we should be killing people for working on the Sabbath.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting program.
And these are the core kinds of beliefs that have to be dealt with. And it's not just a simple matter of expunging them and proving them false.
Sam, and then we'll go to lunch, I think. So say something appetitive.
I'll try. I just thought I should briefly respond to your comment, Scott, which I found to be remarkably eloquent and really amazingly censorious in this context. I mean, it was delivered as though with the eye of omniscience. There's no one in this room who understands religion. No one is evincing the intellectual or moral character necessary to really launch the criticism that many of us are attempting. And I take issue with that, and I can certainly respond to your challenge that I am, for instance, delivering a caricature of Islam. But what I want to point out to you is that how I would not be tempted to respond. I would not be even remotely tempted to say that you should respect my beliefs about Islam, or about terrorism, or about jihadis, or about the demographics of morality in this world. That is a move that is not open to me, and it is perfectly obvious to me that the burden is not upon you to respect my beliefs. You and I disagree, and I will give you reasons for believing what I do, and you will evaluate those reasons. But we've heard from you, and we've heard, quite explicitly from other people in this room, these disgruntled sounds about how what I view as to be over broken taboos here, that we're not respecting people's beliefs. There's arrogance here. This is not sufficiently respectful of the very heartfelt beliefs of religious people. That is a double standard that we're paying a terrible price for. I would just invite you to reflect. When was the last time anyone in this room was admonished to respect another person's beliefs about physics or about biology or about medicine? We don't respect beliefs. We evaluate reasons. And perhaps now is not the moment for it, but I can assure you that I've read the Quran many times. I find it to be a document, and the larger commentarial literature, the hadith around the Quran, I find this to be a literature that makes ready sense of suicidal terrorism. I would never say that the only possible cause of suicidal terrorism is Islam or is religion. There are other examples of suicidal terrorists who are running different software on their brains, but Islam is a remarkably good piece of software to be running if you want to justify, if you want to get a cult of martyrdom and you want to justify this kind of violence. And we see this every day. And we can talk about who the 19 hijackers were and how much economics or their own backstory of oppression played in their behavior. I would say none at all, and I would say the evidence is on my side. And I've looked at your own studies, and I know the kinds of interviews you do with jihadis, and we can talk about that data. But the larger critique here of religion is that religion is functioning by a double standard. The double standard is you should be respecting people's certainties when they are totally uncoupled to evidence, when they are actually vacuous in the way that you just described, although I take issue with that. I think the claim that Muhammad heard the perfect word of the creator of the universe in his cave from the Archangel Gabriel, and now the Quran is not a vacuous statement. And it's a statement that's literally believed and constrains the thinking of Muslims. So anyway, you're a nice guy, I'm a nice guy, we can talk about this. But the problem of religion is that it really does stop conversation in many other contexts.
That will be the last thing, then we go to lunch, because we actually have no more tape.
Sam, I think you're running your own record. I never said anything about respecting anything. I said understanding it. And let me give you... Yes. But I never said anything about respecting those kinds of beliefs. Let me give you an example.
I was going to other people like Aaron Shriver, a very bright person who said yesterday, answered by Andrea.
This...
Wait, yeah, let me just respond to this one.
Well,
point.
but there's only one mic, and it sounds like a very interesting discussion. And we've got... No, I'm going to actually have to tell you that we actually are just about to run out of tape. I really regret that. But we can pick this up in the afternoon session, and we'll be glad to have you exchange comments then. We're finishing off your conversation.
I guess I just have a few piecemeal things to say. The first is I'm not discounting the role of kinship and other variables in the social cohesion and social pressures that get people to do terrifically unwise things. And the problem for me is not, I'm not worried about the bad people in the world. I'm not worried about the sociopaths who have frontal lobe anomalies and can't feel empathy for others and therefore, kill and eat people. There are people like Jeffrey Dahmer in the world, and belief is not necessarily what is so operative. What scares me the most about certain kinds of divisive dogmatisms, and I think religion being the preeminent flavor of that, and at this moment in its history, Islam being the most exquisitely pungent of those flavors, is that it enables perfectly sane, perfectly rational people, people who are not suffering obvious psychopathology, people who are not suffering the kinds of oppressions that would lead anyone else to misbehave terribly, to fly planes into buildings, and to seek to get nuclear weapons so that they can blow themselves up in certain circumstances. And what I hear Scott doing is discounting the role of specific beliefs. And I think it really matters specifically what people believe, and that there are innumerable instances where we can see that the proximate cause of certain behavior is precisely what a person believed, in this case about God and paradise and the evils of infidels. And so one thing I would say to you, Scott, is that you have some, if Islam is really orthogonal to this problem, or a variable number 10 on your list of variables, a few things you should explain. One is, where are the Palestinian Christian suicide bombers? There are, most of the Palestinians are Muslims, obviously, but there are Palestinian Christians who have to go through the same checkpoints. They suffer the same humiliations by Israelis. I mean, it seems to me this is practically a science experiment. We have the same people speaking the same language, living in the same deplorable conditions. One group rather reliably forms a death cult, and the other doesn't. And another example I'd like to put on the table: where are the Tibetan Buddhist suicide bombers? If oppression were enough to so derange a culture that they would blow themselves up on school buses, and where you could get crowds by the tens of thousands calling for the deaths of non-combatants, we would see Tibetan Buddhists blowing themselves up on Chinese school buses. And what we don't see that. What we do see among Tibetan Buddhists, and there are many examples of this, we see Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns who have been tortured in Chinese prisons for decades, but really tortured, with cattle prods and electric shock to the genitals, coming out of these decades of torture, saying things like, "My greatest fear while I was in prison was that I would lose my sense of compassion for my torturers." Now I submit to you, given that behavior, we might think it's pathological on some level to have that kind of compassion, but that behavior is fully explicable in terms of the ideology of Tibetan Buddhism, its emphasis on compassion, its view of torturing as an expression of a person's ignorance within a context of rebirth. I mean, it is anchored by a certain kind of worldview. And I would say to you that given what Muslims believe, you will never find a Muslim coming out of decades of torture in an Israeli prison who will speak in those terms at all. So that's, you can react to those two examples. And
Yeah, good empirical claims. False. Could I just have one slide? One slide.
Oh, this is the handout that's outside, the mysterious handout. I don't know if...
The internet, and whether someone has ever spoken to Osama bin Laden or has ever received an email from Al-Qaeda, they can be operating under the same ideology. I'm not sure how much of what you said has addressed my central concern. I will fully concede that there are other ways to think yourself into suicidal terrorism. I did not know there were any Christian suicide bombers, and it doesn't surprise me, but the thing that I want to point out is that there's a real difference between how easily you can morph the ideology of martyrdom and jihad within Islam to this kind of behavior, and how much more work you have to do in Christianity as it is currently practiced, and in Buddhism. Now, you mentioned the Zen Buddhists, or the kamikaze pilots of World War II. I can easily describe why Zen Buddhism, in combination with Shinto and Japanese military chauvinism, could get you an ideology that was very martial and justify that behavior, and why the Tibetan Buddhists are a very unlikely candidate population for that behavior, given what they believe about compassion. Among Buddhists, one of the real problems with Zen is that it does not emphasize compassion at all, or very much, and you can get this very kind of militant samurai sort of, the sword of wisdom kind of ethos, and without much practical application of compassion. So I'm still arguing for theological consequences of ideas. And I just think that there's an obscurantism at the heart of the way you're talking about this that troubles me, because this is what I think. If the Quran was exactly the way it is, but it contained a single extra line, and that line read, if you see a red-haired woman on your doorstep at sunset, cut her head off. Okay, just imagine a text like this that comes down through the ages that contains a line like that. I can tell you what kind of world we would live in. We would live in a world where red-haired women would be found murdered in the Muslim world. We'd open the New York Times and we would hear that there were, 20 heads found in a bag, and they were all red-haired women. We would also live in a world in which apologists for Islam would look at that behavior and say, that has nothing to do with Islam. There was a news story yesterday about a Mormon man who killed his wife, and she had red hair. Many of those women who were found whose heads were found in the bag in Baghdad were not actually redheads, but some were strawberry blonde. We would hear about women who were shot and not decapitated, and decapitation is the only thing that is sanctioned in the Quran. I mean, this is the kind of gymnastics we would be faced with. And the basic fact about the Quran, as it is with so many other books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and there's nothing worse than Leviticus and Deuteronomy as far as I can tell, but people ignore them, as Richard pointed out. The basic problem with the Quran is that it really does preach hatred and fear of the infidel far more eloquently than it preaches anything else. And that is a problem we are living with, and no amount of casuistry is going to get us around that until we find some way of empowering the forces of moderation in the Muslim world. And I would agree with you, in a hostage negotiation, you don't tell them that your religion is bullshit. I think we are engaged in a very different hostage negotiation now, talking about the role of science and intellectual honesty.
Let me just say about the kamikaze. There's a book called When Cherry Blossoms Fall. They were not militant. There was not much of a militant ideology. They were basically German romantics.
Read Zen at War and Zen war stories. If
This
you
is
want to
their
know.
diaries. This is their diaries.
Can I
But
comment on
let me.
the kamikazes for a moment, just
Yeah.
because it's right, it's in the moment, and I know my esteemed colleague here. He's always trying. I'll hand to you in just a moment. Aren't we forgetting a couple of things here? That, for example, the American admirals in the Pacific, once they saw that Japanese pilots were, instead of firing missiles and bombs to the ships, started flying their planes into the ships, they knew that there was a turn in the war at that point, because as effective as that was, as an act of war, they knew that Japan's capacity to wage war was on a dramatic decline. Because had that been, it was not the first choice for Japan to engage kamikaze bombers. And so if we go to Islam, there's a question I haven't heard asked yet. Because we're looking at suicide bombings as some kind of intrinsically noble exercise within the paradigm and abhorrent from the outside. But would there be suicide bombings if the Islamic community had their own air force and tanks? I don't think so. They would be invoking the military machines that the rest of the West has available to itself.
And they say so quite specifically.
Okay.
I would say I wouldn't be quite that sanguine. There wouldn't be suicide bombings, perhaps, but this notion of martyrdom, either you believe in martyrdom as a genuine metaphysical principle or you don't. If you do, it has certain behavioral and logical consequences. Get the U.S. out of this. Look at the war between Iran and Iraq. The Iranian mothers were sending their teenage sons out to clear minefields with their lives, thinking they were going to get to paradise and get the whole family in after them. We were not, this was not Iran against the great Satan. This was not an expression of their entanglement with Israel. This was, I mean, how do you get a mother to celebrate the suicidal atrocities of her children? She has to believe something. Now, more often than not, I'm with Weinberg, who thinks she has to believe something religious. Now, you can get me some kind of Marxist ideology hammered into her head that may get her to feel consoled by that behavior, but martyrdom is good enough, and martyrdom is very well subscribed. And so whether they're willing to blow up nukes or just not be deterred in a mutually assured destructive sort of way, the way the Soviet Union was, that's really what I'm worried about. I'm worried about a world in which we wake up and we see the psychological equivalents of the 19 hijackers armed with long-range nuclear weapons, and then we have to think, well, are these really rational actors? I mean, are they as pragmatic as Scott says, or are these guys really willing to hit the wall at 400 miles an hour? I think they're telling us they're willing to hit the wall. Many of them are hitting the wall. I think as a rhetorical device, that's pretty persuasive. So I'm inclined to take them seriously.
Yeah, but again,
Lawrence?
Okay, I want to step back a little bit for the debate that you started earlier with your question to Sam to some extent. And actually something you said, Sam, now allows me to bring it back, which is I'm kind of amused. The basic point that you make very cogently is that we have this unusual and totally non-rational acceptance of religious sensibility, especially when those sensibilities are ludicrous. Mm. And the easy example is in this case maybe Islam, or you can pick whatever, or the Old Testament. But you're much more tolerant in your statement, of course, of Buddhism. You talked about the Buddhists who had this compassion, but the compassion was based on nonsense. It's based on reincarnation.
Well, it's actually, I mean, I can unpack that, but...
Yeah, but okay, but the point is, it's clear to me that you're much more willing to, in some sense, be respectful of a nonsensical religious belief which leads to a positive result, perhaps. And yeah, I know, I want you to comment on that. I'm sure you'll not agree with that statement, but I want you to elaborate on it. But I think what that reflects is this question that you were asking earlier, which is the a priori attack on religious faith in general, or in fact not religious faith, but faith in things which you cannot, for which you have no evidence whatsoever, as a general statement that is a bad thing. That making that attack is perhaps not empirically advised, nor is it sensible to do. And I have to say, as an empirical fact, I've evolved in my own discussions. If I talked here 5 years ago, I would have sounded much more like Steve or you or Richard, perhaps. In debating people on the issue of evolution around the country, I suddenly got hit with realizing how offensive, how illogical the statements that were being applied from what I was saying was being received by the people I was talking to. In particular, I remember debating, I forget the guy's name, who was head of the Intelligent Design Network in Kansas. That old fella, he's a nice old guy. Do you remember his name? Anyway, and he trotted out this letter from 50 Nobel laureates trying to defend evolution. They said there's no evidence for design and purpose in the universe. And then the next sentence says there is no design and purpose in the universe. And he said, see, these people are trying to preach atheism. And I thought, that's the worst thing they can be doing, because in fact that has nothing to do with evolution, because evolution has nothing to do with the design and purpose of the universe. It has to do with the development of diversity of species on Earth through natural selection. And so that by going out and immediately attacking the notion that believing things without any evidence is empirically bad, or is just not acceptable, that we are stepping beyond our role as scientists, and inevitably it becomes emotional. You don't mind, you wouldn't preach as much against Buddhism as you would against Islam, because you don't like Islam less than you like Buddhism. And
no,
so
you're right. Well,
so anyway, those are the things I wanted to provoke both of you, but I think sort of it's a way to bridge between the two of you.
Yeah. No, good question. It's not that I'm pulling any punches from Buddhism based on some kind of dogmatic affinity with Buddhists or having been raised Buddhist. I mean, this is not what's going on. I happen to think that within Buddhism there's an extraordinarily nuanced and interesting methodology for meditation, and some very sophisticated discussion of the nature of consciousness, the possibilities of transforming our moment-to-moment perception of the world, that link up rather nicely with what we understand about neuroplasticity and the human brain at this moment. If you sit in a room with the Dalai Lama talking to physicists and neuroscientists, you'll see that there is for the most part, a very open and unconstrained dialogue going on.
But the basic premise is nonsense, right? Reincarnation.
Well, reincarnation, who knows? I mean, I have no, well, no, who knows in the sense that there's no, I mean, there are these spooky stories where, you know, a kid, I am not, okay. Okay.
Well,
reincarnation, you are on firm ground being skeptical of reincarnation. Let me say that, okay? I mean, this is going to take us far afield. I have published a few spooky things about telepathy and reincarnation, which amount to not an endorsement of these beliefs, but just, you know, I hear there's all this data. Someone like Dean Radin writes a book about it. Brian Josephson, a Nobel laureate in physics, blurbs it. I don't have the time to do the meta-analyses or the statistical expertise, so I'm awaiting the evidence, okay? So I don't want to talk about reincarnation. It may be...
Life after death experience.
All right.
No, let me answer the root of your question, which is it really matters what the consequences of these dogmas are. I mean, it's not that all dogma is equally pernicious. And the problem with dogma is that there's no, I mean, you can't necessarily predict just how many lives it's going to cost. And so you take one like this idea that the soul enters the zygote at the moment of conception. You know, life starts at the moment of conception. This sounds totally benign, in fact, life-affirming. Why not believe this, right? Then we invent something called stem cell research, and we have a president who vetoes federal funding of it because he and millions of other Christians think that every 3-day-old human embryo has a soul which has interests which cannot be trumped by the interests of a little girl with full-body burns or spinal cord injury or diabetes. And we seem to be at a stalemate in our ethical debate in this culture. And unless we are willing to criticize the dogma at that point, we really are left in a situation where tens of millions of people have conditions that could be remediated potentially by stem cell research, or for which stem cell research is the best game in town as far as generating therapies, and we are not pursuing it aggressively. So this is where dogma begins to be really troubling. And if a reincarnation, if certainty about reincarnation were doing work that I could see anywhere that was analogous to the work of martyrdom, I would be telling the Buddhists, you have, I mean, this is until you had evidence, this is pernicious nonsense. This is getting a lot of people killed. Now, there are situations in which it may get people killed. I can fully predict what those situations might be, or at least venture a guess. But the problem, that's not the problem I'm seeing with Buddhists now. The problem I'm seeing with Buddhists is they are entangled with a lot of New Age mumbo-jumbo that makes their discourse basically seem unscientific.
It seems to me, ultimately,
Hey,
I'm taking my microphone, but one last thing.
You need a microphone.
One thing? No?
Yeah, but it's not going to go anywhere.
Roger, I have to go to the airport. Can I just make one statement?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to leave you with one thought. I agree there's lots of nonsense in the world, and that science may or may not, though I see no historical evidence that there's any interesting thing science has done for morals yet, or ethics or politics or anything else. In fact, I've seen the contrary. But let's suppose there is. And let's suppose that it's a good mission to get rid of the nonsense in the world. This is your problem, which you're not facing. How to advance science and reason in a fundamentally irrational world. Not to wish it to go away, not to believe that by rational argument it will go away, but how to deal with that problem. It is a very, very hard problem. I got to go. Okay.
Thank you, Scott.
Well,
I'm going to respond to you as you walk out as well.
yeah. Well,
Can I just say one thing, Roger? Because in response to those applause.
well, apparently, according to the people up there, your microphone's trumping mine at the moment.
Okay.
So go on.
All right, I'm going to use my advantage. Rational argument actually does occasionally, and I think rather often, change people's minds about God. I mean, I am the recipient of thousands upon thousands of emails now from people who used to be fundamentalists, who got argued out of it. I mean, trying to square their ludicrous beliefs about the world with the consequences of those beliefs and with the testimony of rationality on 100 fronts has eroded their confidence in those beliefs. And you wouldn't know this. I mean, we have this kind of shibboleth which says you can't what wasn't reasoned into existence can't be reasoned out. The truth, I think, is rather much closer to this, that people are making desperate efforts, rather heroic efforts every day of their lives to be reasonable, to have a coherent worldview. And when those efforts become too costly or too embarrassing, dogma loses. And I can just tell you that there are ministers in this country preaching to flocks, ministers who have completely lost their belief but can't figure out what other job to do. And so we're just literally getting up on Sundays, espousing what they now know to be